Hey, good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Hope you're doing well. And welcome to week 5 of Apologetics Online Edition. I hope you guys are having a good April. And man, cannot believe this month is almost over as we await to hear what is going to become of the rest of the school year. But thinking about you guys often, and I'm enjoying interacting with your gospel reflections. So hope you're doing well. Well, hey, let's get into it. Last week, we looked at the importance of the resurrection of Jesus. We began looking at that topic in our apologetics class here. And we saw how Jesus' resurrection is, again, I use the example of a door, the hinge on which our faith swings, so to speak. Just kind of like a door can't really swing without a hinge, you know? So the Christian faith depends upon Jesus' resurrection. That's sort of the cornerstone of our faith. So we saw that last week. If you haven't viewed last week's video, please do that before you view this one. Okay, so today and this week and for the next couple weeks, we're going to continue looking further at evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Again, since I don't know what the rest of the school year will look like, I want to make sure that I touch all the most important issues, and this is certainly one of them. So that's why we're focusing on this one now. Okay, so we are going to look today, or begin looking today, and for the next several lectures together, at a couple of things. The historical facts that we can learn about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And then 2, after looking at the facts and all of the evidence, what is then the best explanation for that evidence, right? Now, the resurrection is like everything else in the Christian faith in the sense that ultimately you and I have to take a step of faith and believe and embrace it, right? But as we've seen in class this semester, that's true with every worldview. Whether a person is religious or not religious, believes in the God of the Bible, is a Christian, or believes in some other thing, or the Force from Star Wars, or is a complete atheist and only believes in the physical universe. Whatever a person believes ultimately, that person has to take a step of faith to believe what they believe about reality and the point of life, right? That's just the reality of existence that you and I live in. We're human. We don't know everything. And so, number 1, there's that. Okay, so like everything else, we have to take a step of faith. But number 2, and this is what I'm hoping to really communicate to you all, is that believing in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is not something where you and I just have to check our brain at the door and take a blind leap into the dark, right? This is a historical truth claim based upon verifiable objective evidence. There is great evidence for the physical resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, okay? There have been many atheists over the years who have set out to try and disprove the resurrection in Christianity, and in the process ended up becoming saved. They became Christians because they saw the evidence is so overwhelming. And so Lee Strobel and I believe Josh McDowell, they're two examples of many. But anyway, so I want to just look at this with you guys. This, again, is going to be sort of a 30,000-foot overview. There are lots of resources available that delve more deeply into these issues. But for the sake of keeping these YouTube videos somewhat brief, and just the realities of online learning right now, we're just going to kind of delve, over the surface and just sort of look at everything from that bigger picture. But again, as I mentioned last week and as we've talked about, and I want you guys to remember this, it's so important that the resurrection of Jesus and indeed the entirety of our Christian faith is not just some subjective internal religious feeling that you have or that I have, right? This is based upon the objective reality that 2,000 years ago, a man rose from death and walked out of his own tomb. That's what the Christian faith is based on a truth claim, objective reality, an event that happened in space and time on this planet. Okay? So that's very important because, again, there's a big assumption in our culture today that religious things, spiritual things are all just sort of subjective and internal and individual, and hey, if that works for you, cool, that's great, glad you found your thing. But that's not actually the way it is. That's not the way it is. Jesus has made these claims, and Jesus has risen from the dead, and every person on this planet has to deal with that and has to make a decision about Jesus because these things really happened. So I hope that makes sense. So keep that in mind now as we begin talking about Jesus' resurrection. All right, so today we are going to be looking at the first of four aspects of Jesus' resurrection. And today we're going to be looking at that aspect, which is also the title of this lecture, called Fatal Torment. Okay, Fatal Torment. Now, first thing, basically everyone who exists, there's a few people that are the exception to that, but basically everyone believes that there was, nearly 2,000 years ago, a Jewish man who was a rabbi named Jesus, Yeshua of Nazareth, who was crucified on a Roman cross. Okay, so we're talking about, obviously, as Christians, we believe that. People of most other religions, Islam being an exception to that, but people of most other religions, even atheists, people who don't believe that there is a God, or people who are agnostic, who just think, well, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. We can't really know. Pretty much everyone agrees, though, that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified on a Roman cross. Okay, that's not really contested historically, no matter what a person's views are. Okay, so first of all, there's that. Now, couple things, and this is kind of the meat of what we're talking about today. All right. Number one, the Romans were experts at death. Okay, the Romans did not invent crucifixion. It was invented, I believe, by the Persian Empire several centuries before. But the Romans perfected death. They were experts at death. Okay, so crucifixion was designed to be a brutal, torturous punishment and death. And it was designed, number one, to utterly and completely humiliate the person who was crucified. Okay, so you've seen probably pictures or paintings portraying Jesus on the cross. And for the sake of modesty, he's always wearing some kind of loincloth or something like that. But the way that this actually would have happened, he would have been stripped completely naked. Okay, and part of the reason for that was to completely shame and humiliate the victim being crucified. It was to, again, you are nailed to a tree and you're completely naked, exposed for everyone to see, right? And again, in that culture, and the same thing in Middle Eastern culture still today, you don't expose yourself publicly at all. That's a very shameful thing to do. Okay, so it was designed to completely shame and humiliate the victim, and it was also designed to make death a long, slow process with maximum pain and, and suffering. Okay, so again, when they would nail a person to the cross, through the wrists, about right there or so, and then through the ankle bones, the person would be nailed and their arms would be like this. You can't really see me, but And so what they would do is, in that position, you couldn't get any air in your lungs. So in order to breathe, the person would have to push themselves up on their feet, which had been nailed to the cross. That's why they were nailed with their legs kind of at a 90-degree angle. And you would push yourself up to inhale air, and then you would let yourself back down to exhale. And you would have to do that every time you wanted to breathe. So number one, you can imagine the pain and the agony that would cause each time you took a breath. Okay, and then even more so for Jesus, because his back, if you remember, had been ripped open by the cat of nine tails. So every time he would go up on the cross and then back down, it would just further make that pain worse. Okay, so crucifixion was a horrific way to die. Extremely painful. Again, it was also in the Roman Empire reserved for the worst criminals. So it was reserved for non-Roman citizens and reserved for horrible, horrible criminals. Primarily, those are the people who would be crucified. Okay. Now, given all of that, okay, that's just that culture's aspect of it. Now, for the Jewish people particularly, crucifixion was all of that, but even worse, because in the book of Deuteronomy, in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, God had said, "Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree." Okay, so for the Jewish people, when they looked upon someone who had been crucified, they believed that person to be under God's divine curse. Okay, so that's how they viewed Jesus when Jesus was being crucified, right? Public shame, right? Public torment, humiliation, and he must be under God's curse. That's why this has happened to him. Okay? All that to say, if the apostles and the disciples were trying to make up a story about Jesus to get people to believe in him, that he had truly risen from death, they would not have made crucifixion the method of his execution. All right, so again, keep that in mind. Okay, keep that in mind, because as we look at these stories, right, if they were just fabricating the story of the resurrection, crucifixion would not have been the method of execution that they would have made up, right? Because all of the Jews were scandalized that Jesus was crucified because they viewed him as being under God's curse, right? So again, it's kind of like the women being the first witnesses to the resurrection, right? If you were making this story up, you would not have put those details in there. Same thing with this. Okay. Also, what about the location of Jesus' tomb? Sometimes people make the claim, and this is actually a claim people will make, is like, well, maybe he didn't really rise from death. Maybe they just went to the wrong tomb. Yeah, okay. We will deal with that more in depth in a different lecture, but just briefly, the tomb in which Jesus was buried belonged to a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Okay, he's a historical figure. We know he existed. He was a very high-class member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish council, kind of like the Jewish Supreme Court that governed religious life for Israel. Okay. Now, again, if you were trying to make up a story about all of this and fabricate this tale, right, you would not have included a high-class member of the Jewish Supreme Court, the vast majority of whom condemned Jesus and are the ones who had him put to death, right? You would not have put that as a person in your sort of roster as being on Jesus' team, okay? And again, this whole idea that they just went to the wrong tomb, well, that's so ridiculous. We'll cover that in a different lecture, but that's not what happened. It's not what happened. Again, we know you can literally go to Israel today. I know several people, and I have friends and pastors who have gone to Jerusalem, to this tomb that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, where Jesus was buried, and it's empty. Like, you can literally go see it. You can Google it in 5 seconds and pull it up. This is not something that's hidden that nobody has access to. Like, this has been open for 2,000 years, you know? And so, again, I mean, that's legit. That's a real thing, you know? So, a couple other things real quick, and then I'll wrap this up. We've talked about this before with the reliability of the Bible, but the source documents used for the Gospels came very early after these events took place. We're talking within a decade or two of the events happening. These things are written down. Okay, and those things were written down based upon oral tradition and testimony that came from the people who knew Jesus and who witnessed these events. Right? Also, the story of Jesus' resurrection, it lacks elements of something called legendary development. In other words, the story of Jesus' resurrection isn't something that was made up by the disciples or the early church, and then over time grew and grew and grew and grew until it became, the Christian faith. That's not what happened, right? The stories of Jesus' resurrection from the very beginning are the same as they are today. Right? So this is not a story that just sort of was made up and then grew over time. This is something that happened, again, in space and time, historically, on this planet. And right after it happened, boom, the story was there. And it's been unchanged for 2,000 years. Okay? This is great, great evidence in favor of Jesus' resurrection. Okay? So when you take all of these things, and again, we'll get into this more in depth in later lectures, and we'll tie all these things together. But when you look at the historical realities of ancient Israel, and you look at Jesus, and you look at all of these things, and we're not even talking about the Bible. We're talking about, you look at just extra biblical, beyond the Bible sources, it makes the most sense to believe that Jesus was crucified, that he was buried, and that he rose again. This is what makes sense. Nothing else, no other option makes sense. And the reason that that's the case is because this really happened. Because Jesus Christ is who he said he was. He is God, and he rose from death. Okay? And so this lecture and the next few that we do, we're going to really be digging into that. So I hope that this helps strengthen your faith. Or if you're doubting, I hope this helps convince you and bring you to that place of faith, because this is very important. Again, this is sort of that hinge on which our faith swings. Okay, and so again, the claims of Jesus' resurrection are not, oh, Jesus is alive in my heart. That's great. No, I mean, yeah, he is, but no, this is that he physically, objectively, historically rose from death. The only person to ever do that. Okay. And that's what our Christian faith is all about. So I hope this has been a help for you guys. I miss you guys. Can't wait to see you hopefully soon. God bless you. And until our next lecture, have a wonderful week.